Okay, thank you. My name is Melissa Timmons. I'm a front-end developer and designer. I work for a company here in the city. It's a nonprofit organization called Hearing First. I do front-end development and design for them. I started in 2008, kind of trial by fire, like kick you to the curb, figure it out kid, and I did, and I fell in love with it. And so we're just going to talk about kind of an introductory discussion about what front-end development is, the role, the languages that we use, and just maybe some resources and stuff for you afterwards. So in the most basic sense, a front-end developer uses design files to build out front-end code. That is typically HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They can be used through a compiler, through preprocessors for CSS, lots of different JavaScript languages, libraries, and resources there. But at the end of the day, everything just spits out as HTML, CSS. You often act as a liaison between a designer and a back-end developer, and the back-end developer. And I guess really what I mean by that is when you get that design file, there are going to be elements and components in there that will need some back-end programming in large-scale projects. And so it's kind of your job as a front-end developer to kind of mock that out in like with maybe just some basic HTML, and then turn that over to your back-end developer to help you get through the programming aspects of that with whatever language and code base that they're using. You're also known as the end user advocate, the accessibility champion, and you wear many, many hats. When we're talking about the end user advocate, really when you build websites for anyone, you're really building them for your end users. You're not building them for yourself or for your design team or to make amazing, great things. I mean, those are all nice goals to have, but at the end of the day, can people use your products? Can they find the information that they're looking for? And can you get them on and off your site in relatable, meaningful ways so they'll come back to your product again and again? In terms of accessibility and what that means, we're looking at everything from disabilities to just simply not having a mouse or a keyboard at your disposal. And can your site function and work in the capacity of maybe even just like a lower internet connection that's not as fast? So as you're like starting to get into your code, as you're starting to build things, checking your runtimes, checking, can you tab through your elements? Do you have alt tags on your images? Those are like some just quick accessible components that you really need to be considering as we're building out HTML. I was very fortunate to go to an event apart in Orlando in October, and Dan Mall, he's great. There were millions of great speakers. It was so cool. But this really struck me. He said, when it comes to making web products, front-end languages are more important than back-end languages. And I apologize if there are back-end programmers here. That's my bad. But at the end of the day, really, the web pages that you're looking at are HTML and CSS. And so it's important to understand those pieces first and to kind of have a respect for that and know what that means in terms of how it relates to your back-end languages. But you can't understand that without knowing the front-end languages as well. So HTML basics. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is the structure of the site. We typically try to keep our styles, layouts, everything out of the HTML, but it's really the most basic piece of web technology. You can spit out HTML, and you don't have to have styles, you don't have to have layout, you can have black text on a white background, and you can still convey information to your end users. When we talk about writing semantically, that's really important. It will help you like tenfold as you go down the process, using footers for using the footer tag for your footer content, using form tags to wrap your forms in, the nav tag to wrap your navigation in, basically pairing those tags with the elements that are coming from your designer. And when we talk about building from the beginning with accessibility in mind, what we're talking about is like, okay, I know I have this image, I know it's gonna need an alt tag. Yeah, and we're looking at ARIA and all sorts of different things down that road. But I would really encourage you to look at accessibility at Alley Cats, on YouTube. There's lots of great resources out there, but I would really encourage you to get familiar with accessibility too. HTML basic breakdown, you start your HTML with your HTML tag and your doc type declaration, then we drop into the head, and in the head, that contains site title, page title, meta tags, SEO information, links to external style sheets, additional files. This isn't something that's visible to your end users, however, you can right-click, hit inspect on your developer tools, and you'll see the head there, and you'll see all the fancy stuff in there when you're digging through your site. The body tag comes after the head, and it contains, this is where the content of your site lives, this is what people see visually, and the header, the main content footer, go all here. This is a really nasty, this is what HTML looks like without CSS, and it's just pretty plain. When we start talking about CSS, it's important to also consider, I'm just going to say this right up front, your browser, and check out caniuse.org for any bleeding edge CSS stuff, anything that you're questioning whether or not this will work in this browser or another browser. I'd encourage you to check that out. But anyway, so CSS talks about, is short for cascading style sheets. And as you write CSS, you're writing it typically in a separate file. Usually for most sites, it's called a style.css sheet. File that you'll link to in the head. The C in CSS refers to the cascade. And we'll talk about more on that in a little bit. Several naming conventions can help you organize your CSS into component-based styling, things that refer to various chunks of content on your website. Okay, so when we're talking about the cascade, we're talking about external style sheets. They typically do not have they are not the highest priority. But if you'll think about this, so we start with the external style sheets, then we have styles in the head, and they take more importance over, they kind of override some of the other styles. Then we have inline styles, and those override what's in the head and what's in your external style sheet. And then lastly, anything you tagging with important is going to override just about everything. And that isn't to be used all the time. It's kind of crazy when you get into a style sheet and you see people with important. It's okay, that's not how we do it. You end up causing a lot of problems that way. Classes and IDs kind of relate to this in that when you can have multiple classes on a page or multiple elements using the same class on a page, and typically we want our IDs to be singular. You don't want to have more than one ID on a page. Or more than one of the same ID. So if we were building a staff page and we had images from each of us, and we have an image wrapper, we can have a div class equals image wrapper, and every one of our pictures would have that container, but maybe my picture has an ID of Melissa, and yours wouldn't. Yours would have your name, and so on. Yeah, so we want to keep the IDs separate and singular on a page, and classes can be used throughout. When we're talking about, okay, I'm going to botch this, specificity, apologies. Keeping things more broad, more global is helpful. Really hone in on specific things only when necessary. Naming conventions are crazy. There's all sorts of different ways to name things. There's all sorts of different theories on the best practices. These are kind of some of the top things that you're going to see right now. These are trending. BEM is huge. SMAX is huge. Atomic Design. Brad Frost was also at that conference, and he was talking a lot about atomic design and design systems. And as we get into a more aggressive, component-based styling, there's lots of different tools out there that we can use, but these are probably the top three. I would also encourage you to check out this article. It has a lot of good references about utilizing BEM but then also looking at like JavaScript and like how we can use JavaScript to help name things in our divs and our HTML structures. So our CSS Design Elements, this is kind of like the lipstick on the page, yeah? This is the stuff that makes it flashy and fun and like the part that I really love and kind of geek out about, and it's kind of the designer part of me, I think. But so when we talk about fonts, we're talking about units of measure, load times, files. Those are all things to consider when we're selecting what files or what fonts to display. You don't want to load your site with a ton of fonts because it'll like drag your load times down so fast. And so then we have frustrated end users, and we have like ridiculous load times, and so then you have frustrated bosses. And so the more that you can streamline your font systems, the better. In terms of units of measure, we're looking at like ems, pixels, rems. Those are kind of the basic ones, but then we're getting into right now some really cool stuff with like variable fonts and using the viewport to help size our fonts, and that stuff gets really cool and it's way fun to play with. When we're talking about background images or images in general, PNGs, JPEGs, SVGs, and GIFs. The PNGs and the GIFs and SVGs can be transparent, JPEGs cannot. Typically, your GIF has a lower file size, and so sometimes that can help you reduce your load times. Having worked with SVGs a lot lately as a background image, there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with them, but as soon as you drop them in a background image, you're a little bit more restricted with what you can do in terms of animating them. When we're talking about states, we're talking about hover and focus and visited, and that relates to accessibility in a lot of ways. When we're talking about focus specifically, that is like when you open up a page and you start hitting your tab button, and you'll see a little blue, well, it depends, I guess, on the site. The little focused element will start moving throughout the page. And the goal is, like if you're writing really good HTML and you've got solid CSS, you're tracking that little piece all the way through your page. That will help in terms with accessibility for people who are using keyboards, who can't use mouses, who are motor restricted, different things like that. Your hover state, I would encourage you to still use it. A lot of people are kind of like, well, I don't really use hover state anymore because mobile, like if you look at your phone, there's no way to hover, right? Like when you're like clicking around, you're not really hovering, yeah? So when I use hover state, it's most specifically related to desktop design that I'm building out, right? And then I'll have other pieces like focus that I'll use for mobile. So pseudo classes are super cool, and you can do some seriously fun stuff with pseudo classes. And if you've ever looked at like single div art, like, you know what I'm talking about, because they have like one div and they have a million pseudo classes, like before, after, and they design these incredible things like a panda. They make a panda face, right, with just one div, and it's just really, really fun. And I would encourage you to just play around with that, just because it's fun. Okay, so the other piece, I guess, sorry about that. The other piece is border radius, shadows. All of those things add depth and interest to your site and really help bring your site to life and kind of make it your own and unique. So layout. Layout right now in CSS is like super huge. And that is because grid is a thing. Like CSS grid has really come to light in the last probably year or so. There's been a lot of really good browser support for that. Previously there wasn't. Previously it was just this browser, that browser, this thing works over here. And so now like all of the browsers are kind of really adapting this, and it's making it like so we can actually do graphic design on the web, which is something that we really couldn't do before. And when we're talking about responsive design, you know, we're talking about like going all the way from mobile to tablet to your watch and making sure that like your site is working on all of these devices and is attractive and usable, no matter what browser, no matter what device you're running. Before we did that, before responsive design, and this is what I learned HTML4 and CSS2, and that was before all of this crazy cool stuff happened. And you actually use tables to make a layout, and that's like super old school, like not okay. well, it's not that it's not okay. It's just really, like, it's outdated. So anyway, it's just such a blessing to have, like, super cool stuff like Flexbox and CSS Grid to build these amazing, amazing layouts. And Jen Timmons has, like, she's coined this term intrinsic web design, and it really relates to providing beautiful content in incredible ways on the web that we just really didn't have the ability to do. What CSS Grid does for us now that Flexbox and traditional responsive web design doesn't do is Grid will provide the vertical design, whereas a lot of Flexbox is just horizontal. And so now that we have this super cool vertical stuff, we can just do these really amazing stuff, really amazing projects, really, like, people are taking posters and they're making them actually into websites. And it's beautiful to see this transition happen. It's really exciting. So bleeding edge CSS, this is the stuff that's, like, really, like, happening right now, or at least that I've got my eye on, stuff I'm learning. CSS animations as opposed to just JavaScript-based animations. There's a lot that you can do in CSS to animate elements, to animate your UI, to provide really cool things to your users. CSS Grid and intrinsic web design are really hot. CSS in JS is going to go against what I'm getting ready to tell you about JavaScript, but it's basically taking CSS and writing it into your JavaScript file. And that is, it's a little controversial right now, but it's really cool. It's cool. So you take the CSS, and instead of writing it in a styles.css file, you're writing it inside the JavaScript component. Basically, yeah. So, like, if you have, well, we'll talk about it later. This is just something, yeah, it's coming up. So then we also have CSS variables, and we have variable fonts, and they're pretty sweet. So this is the same HTML with some CSS, and I apologize, it's a little bit mid-project, and I abandoned it to build the real thing, but it kind of gives you an idea of the difference between the white background, black text, and then what we can do with some really cool gradients and different stuff like that. So, JavaScript Basics. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on JavaScript today, but basically what JavaScript does is provides the functional support for the website. And this is client-side, so that means it's front-end. We're not making calls back to the server. It's great for form validation. Before we submit the form to the server, it can check and see if boxes have been filled and different things like that. It's great for state and event handling. It's beautiful for animations. There are libraries as far as the eye can see for just about every use case you could ever imagine. And then there are supporting elements like Angular, React, Vue, and others. So we're going to talk a little bit really quick about the end user, because at the end of the day, that's who we're doing all of this for. And as I said earlier, always build for your users first. It is the most important thing. And if you know that, for instance, like at Hearing First, we have families who have children who don't hear, and they're using hearing technology to learn to listen and speak. And so as we're building content for them, we're providing them with videos that have transcripts. We're providing them, just consider your user base, know where they're coming from and what they're needing, and reach out to them and meet them where they are, as opposed to just doing the cool thing that you want to do because it's fun, right? So what we do is we use analytics to help provide us with a basis of understanding that comes in terms of either, like Google Analytics, like analytics that we get from our platforms, but know what they're, are they hitting this on their browser from their website or from their phone or from their desktop? Are they on their tablet? Where can we reach these people to provide them the best source of information and the best user experience? And when we're talking about, once we've kind of determined our base, then we start looking at our edge cases and where we can meet our edge cases. And those are the people that maybe have the slower internet connections that live in rural Idaho, or who knows, right? And so we have to do some discovery and find some elemental instruction for us that we can provide faster load times or bigger font sizes. It can just be small changes like that that just really help your users out. CanIUse.org is probably one of the most helpful tools for me personally when I'm looking, because I tend to want to develop with like the latest and greatest tech, right? Like I'm like raring to go, itching to get out the gate, and it is so frustrating when I get there and I'm like, no, I can't use it. But you have to know like where your parameters are, and to provide that is just so important. So CanIUse is a really helpful resource that will allow you to see what is supported on what browsers and what we can really kind of get away with in terms of some of the bleeding edge tech. Browser Stack is phenomenal for testing your actual site on actual browsers, on actual virtual machines somewhere in the cloud. Hotjar is great for watching your users, for gathering user information, for maybe not necessarily it's not as invasive as maybe like putting together a user focus group, but it's enough to give you kind of an idea of what your users are hitting on your site. There's really not a replacement for feedback from your users, though. At the end of the day, when you're talking to your clients, when you're talking to the people that are hitting your site on the regular, like you need to be listening to them and kind of internalizing that a little bit and figuring out what you can do to provide a better service for them. Tools I've used, text editors. All you really need is a text editor and a browser to do front-end development at the end of the day, right? Most basic. I have used Visual Studio Code, PHP Storm, Sublime Text, Atom, Notepad++, Eclipse, just to name a few. Design and images, I've used Sketch, Illustrator, Adobe XD, Figma, Photoshop, and GIMP. Versioning, GitHub, Bitbucket, and then browser developer tools. Yeah, that right-click and inspect is my best friend, and it's getting me out of many jams. Articles, videos, and tools. Smashing Magazine, CSS Tricks. These guys, I read them really, I probably read an hour a day of front-end development stuff, yeah? And because it moves so fast, this tech is like coming down the pike really quick. You should be catching up as much as you can. Subscribe to just about as many emails as you possibly can. Read, get to know people, follow them on Twitter, figure out what it is, the people who are really like making the big tech changes happen, follow them and be aware, because that is how you stay relevant and that is how you stay good at what you do. Educating yourself, and that was one of the things when I got into front-end development that I was most excited about. I tend to get bored with the same day-to-day kind of thing, and so this is kind of a gig that you don't get bored. There's a lot of new. Let's see, and these are the people I follow. And not all of them, but just some really good names in the industry. All of these people do, and I can run down the list if you want to know what they do. Otherwise, follow them on Twitter, check out their blogs. They're really incredible. And that's all I got. So thank you very much. Maybe later, if that's all right. Thank you.